All righty. Well, thanks everybody for joining us this evening. Really happy to welcome Abby from Pheasants and Quail Forever this evening to talk about pollinators. And it's kind of a beautiful evening to be in talking on Zoom and listening to things versus out and about. If you have any questions, we're going to ask you to hold them to the end, or if you want to punch them into the chat, we can go through the chat later on. That just helps us kind of keep flowing, and we are recording this. So if you have, if you have questions or want to go back to it, we'll try to get this up on our YouTube channel here fairly quickly, and then should be sending that link out via email since everybody has registered email. Abby, I'm gonna let you take over.
All right. Well, thanks.
Oh, hold on a second, Abby. I muted you, muted everybody. Uh,
There we go. Can you hear me now?
yep.
All right. So yeah, thanks Robert for inviting me to talk. These online presentations are always a lot of fun and kind of informal, which is helpful to some people. So thanks for putting this together. My name's Abby Prieur. I work for a nonprofit called Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever. And it's pretty apparent from our logos and our names that we do indeed care about populations of upland game birds. But in our mission is also other wildlife. So I kind of fall solidly within that other wildlife category as a farm bill biologist and also the monarch butterfly and pollinator specialist for our team. And I cover Eastern Ohio. And the name of the kind of the also known as name of our organization is the Habitat Organization. So we really focus on what we can do on the ground to create habitat for these critters to live, because that really makes huge impact for a lot of our game species. And is really the way to build back some of these populations like quail that we've lost in Ohio. And same thing's happening with pollinators. So we focus a lot on the plants on the ground and building back that habitat. I did want to recognize, I'm a Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever employee, but my position is also supported by a NIFWIF grant as well as Division of Wildlife. And I'm just realizing that I forgot to put the NRCS logo on there, and they're essential to supporting my position. So um, have a lot of people to thank that enable me to do my work and speak with you guys. So um, they're doing good stuff out there. So the purpose of this presentation is to help you guys think a little bit about how you can take pollinators, aka bugs, into account when you might be managing even for other wildlife on your property. Pollinator populations, insect populations are declining globally, and we want to reverse that before it starts to cause us even more issue than it has already. And I also want to familiarize you with the basic concepts of how other wildlife like deer, turkey, pheasants, quail, popular game species that people are also often managing for. I want to connect the dots between this pollinator habitat that we build out to support bugs and how it still benefits and can also be deer habitat, turkey habitat, quail habitat, songbird habitat. It can really help out a lot of different types of wildlife in addition to pollinators. So to get started, I just want to talk about what pollinator habitat is. And there we go, lost control of my pointer. So what is habitat? Without getting too sciencey and ecology about it, it's really anything that a wildlife species needs to live out its full life cycle. When you think habitat, your mind might go automatically to food, and food is really important, but habitat also involves, how wildlife protect themselves from predators, where they meet mates, how they raise their young, where they find food, how they find water, and how they get around on the landscape. So it can involve a lot of different elements, but food, water, and shelter are the big three. And here in Ohio, water really is pretty readily available, and we don't focus too much on water unless we're dealing with aquatic species. So I'm not going to talk too much about that today, but we will talk quite a bit about the food and the shelter or cover aspect. So, in the context of supporting insect life or pollinating insects like bees, butterflies, moths, beetles, flies, etc., um, the first thing I wanted to talk about is food. So, pollinators, like any other wildlife species that you might be familiar with, they need food all throughout the year when they're out and active, and when they're on the ground in Ohio. So we have some native bees that emerge really early in the year, like April. And then we have other insects that, stick around October, November, on these warm days, you can still go out and find some, natty things flying around. And as long as those insects are active, they need fuel to be able to get around. So when we talk food, we're really thinking, the full season of when these bugs are out on the landscape. A lot of people are familiar that nectar is a food source for pollinators, a sugary carbohydrate-laden substance that they collect when plants bloom, when there's flowers out. And that nectar can be produced by trees like oaks and maples that bloom very early in the year. It can be produced, by our common wildflowers like purple coneflower, Virginia mountain mint. So having a lot of these different flowers that bloom throughout the year and produce nectar throughout the year helps those pollinators find the energy that they need. Pollen is also really essential. A lot of us are familiar with pollen in the context of seasonal allergies, but it is important for supporting our wildlife. So bees will collect pollen to provision their nests. They create what's called bee bread, and then when the larvae hatch out of the egg, they may eat that bee bread that's partly pollen. So that's used as forage. Leaf material tends to be a really important one. So the actual leaves of plants are eaten, primarily we're familiar with caterpillars eating leaves. And a lot of people know the story of the monarch butterfly and how its larval stage or its young require milkweed leaves in order to grow and then transform into their butterfly stage. And that story really repeats across a lot of different butterflies and a lot of different moths. We have butterflies and moths that may specialize on pawpaw trees or, bee balm. So we have a lot of these insect and plant associations with these insects needing the leaf material or other material from plants to get through their life stages and become adults. And we call those plants that support specific pollinators host plants. So when we have a specialist insect that has this relationship with a special plant, we call that plant a host plant. So those are really important when we're trying to support diverse wildlife. We want to have a lot of different plants because a lot of those plants support our diverse native insects as well. And then last but not least, other insects can also be forage for pollinators. And the little story I like to tell is about some of our wasp species in Ohio. A lot of people don't like wasps. I totally understand why, but their ecology is kind of cool. So when they are building nests, what the mother wasp does is she eats nectar to get out and around. We do have some wasps that eat other things like carrion or meat, but a lot of our wasps actually are just eating nectar like our bees and our butterflies are. But she has to find this insect prey to provision her nests. So what she does is she goes out and she finds caterpillars primarily. She stings them and paralyzes them, and then she grasps them with her legs, and then she flies off to her nest. and she puts those paralyzed caterpillars in a nest cell. And then she goes out and finds another one and another one. And so that mom wasp may put 20, 30 individual caterpillars in one nest cell and lay an egg. And when that egg hatches, that larval wasp eats those live but paralyzed caterpillars. So really brutal, very, coming out of the Halloween season, very appropriate seasonally. And again, people not liking wasps, like maybe gross. We don't want to hear about that, but maybe the context changes when we talk about how paper wasps specialize or will eat and carry off armyworm caterpillars, which can greatly damage crops, and people don't like them because they'll put bare spots in their lawns. And so these wasps are natural pest predators, and they do the work for free. So that can be kind of cool. So in summary, our insect life is really diverse. They need a lot of different types of forage, and the type of forage that they need might differ throughout their life stage and might differ throughout the year. So plant diversity and also putting native plants that, have evolved in Ohio and have been here for a long, long time, putting those types of plants out on the landscape is really what best supports our insect life. Now, again, just like deer and turkeys or quail or songbirds, pollinators need more than just food to live their lives. They also have to hide from predators and find places to put their nests where their babies will be safe. And a lot of people aren't familiar with where and how pollinators nest, and this is really interesting. So they might just find a clump of native grass and put the nest in the middle of that clump, and you'll see a video of that later. They will also find the stems of dead or live plants. So some of our shrub species have hollow stems. We call those pithy stems. And they might be able to crawl in there, or they can drill into that soft center and create a nest for their larvae, like you see in the bottom right photo there. That's a bee at different stages of development. Laying dead wood, standing dead wood in the forms of snags. Insects will get in those beetle holes, they'll create their nest there, and then they'll cap them off with mud or vegetation, and that's the photo in the top right. Compost piles, rock crevices, and bare ground is really important too. So when we're building out pollinator habitat, this bare ground element is really important for our ground nesting bees that, go down into the soil or a crack in the soil, and they build their nests there. They sometimes will also use old rodent burrows. So having access to that bare ground is really essential. And you'll see that repeated for a lot of our other wildlife that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. So again, insect life is very diverse, and with that, we have a lot of different life histories that we, need to support if we're trying to support our pollinating insects. But hopefully this makes you think about your property in a little different way. We may remove dead wood for firewood or for aesthetic reasons. Some people like a really clean forest floor surface, but you are removing pollinator nesting material. Some people like to rake away their leaves, but dead leaves is a really great place for our native bees to overwinter. And then things like tillage or stands of grass that are too thick and have a lot of thatch buildup, that's eliminating that bare ground resource for our pollinators. So I think it's just worth being mindful of how your actions and management decisions might shift things for pollinators on your property. And we'll connect that to other wildlife here in a second. So I put this slide in almost every presentation just to, again, kind of get you thinking a little deeper about this topic. So when I say pollinator habitat, I know probably 99% of us, including myself, we're referencing and thinking about that top left photo. Maybe it's over here for you guys. It's a grassland, wildflower laden, very sunny space. Some people call it meadow or prairie. And that is absolutely great pollinator habitat. We have a lot of forage, we have bare ground, we have these dead stem structures if you're not mowing it all the time. So it is absolutely pollinator habitat. But I hope you recognize in, some of the facts from the earlier slides that shrubland, old field is also pollinator habitat. Forests are really important pollinator habitat, and those trees are going to bloom early and they produce that dead wood feature and the leaves on the ground for overwintering. So those are also wonderful pollinator habitat and really important to improve and protect. And even wetlands. There are wetland bees that, are associated with things like, I'm assuming pickerel weed and American lotus. So these wetland plants, I don't know much about that, but we do have flowering plants in wetlands, and where there are flowers, there are insects. So if you are managing on your property, mostly woodland or forest, or you have a lot of shrubby stuff and it's native, we don't need to eliminate that habitat to be able to support pollinators. I like to kind of work with what we've got already. And if you've got some open ground, we can improve that to look like something in the top left photo. But you likely have pollinator habitat on your property, even if you don't have a big prairie field. Now, with all that being said, I'm going to reverse backwards and tell you that for the context of the rest of this presentation, if I do say pollinator habitat, I'm going to be talking about something that looks like these photos. So, a strip plot or a field that is open and made primarily of native wildflowers. Usually these pollinator habitats, we want them to have 50 to 75% of the plants be forbs or, wildflowers, broadleaf plants. Those are terms that are kind of interchangeable. And then the remaining 25 to 50% would hopefully be native grass. But really these pollinator habitats, we want to have a lot of diverse flowering plants in them. And these are photos from Ohio. So I try to set good expectations for what pollinator habitat looks like in Ohio. And these are two good ones. So let's talk a little bit about how other wildlife use pollinator habitat. And the secret is, this is my first time presenting on this concept. So hopefully in the future have more detail and more citations and have read more scientific papers about this topic. But for today, I'm going to be referencing some really awesome extension publications, and I've included the QR code and citations for those if you want to check them out yourself. And hopefully I'm going to just keep it basic and kind of connect the dots for you guys for the purposes of this presentation. So plants. There are plants, it's nothing but plants in one of these pollinator plots. But just like insects, our other wildlife like deer and rabbits, our grazers and our browsers, they are eating plants for all of or the majority of their diet. So leaves and stems of herbaceous plants are really important. Especially for deer. A publication that I'm going to reference later states that approximately 75% of a white-tailed deer's diet in the spring and summer is forbs. And again, those forbs are wildflowers. So this is like, our native food plot here. We have these leaves and stems that are emerging and maturing at different times of the year, and deer can come in and select the forage that they need the most at that time of year. So they have really high or really important nutrient needs during lactation and during antler development. And so the deer have a lot of different forage to select from in these pollinator plots, and they can go in and find the newly emerged, really succulent vegetation to meet their dietary needs anywhere from spring, summer, and fall. Okay. And then we also have, obviously, before a broadleaf plant flowers, it produces a bud where the flower is going to open up. Some wildlife really like to pluck those off and eat those. So quail will eat the buds of herbaceous plants. And then, of course, seeds. So after the flower matures and is pollinated by our friendly native insects, it produces seeds that hopefully spur the next generation of wildflowers. But a lot of our wildlife, especially our birds, so quail are primarily seed eaters as adults. And of course, we've seen things like goldfinches that will sit on top of thistles and pluck the seeds off the tops of those plants and eat those. So these habitats produce a lot of seed for perhaps bird species of interest as well. And then I threw in a few oddballs here. So I did say these plots, pollinator habitat, produce mast as well. So obviously our broadleaf plants aren't necessarily producing nuts and fruits, or what we call mast, but I love to see a pollinator plot with some shrub thickets in there. And if you let the plots go long enough, you will absolutely get blackberries in Ohio. So we do have these woody plants that will produce nuts and fruits in pollinator habitat if you manage them to do so, which I think is a really great idea for a lot of different wildlife that need a shrubby or cover thicket component to grassland habitat. So again, I tried to include some photos of projects that I've worked on, just to increase the interest a little bit. So I've got this great pollinator plot out in Stark County. I was walking around there this summer and did a Facebook post on deer browse and pollinator plot. So these were some of my observations. We have I think it's either a black-eyed Susan or a purple coneflower. I think we've got maybe one of each. But you can very obviously see the deer browse here and here and here and here. And some of these cuts are pretty clean. So if you allow me some creative license, maybe I'll say that a rabbit clipped these two lower ones and a deer clipped the top two. But they really like the black-eyed Susan and the purple coneflower, whichever one that may be. And then this is positively a brown-eyed Susan. And again, you'll see that that one has been clipped. And us farmville biologists, we always comment on like the deer absolutely hammer the brown-eyed Susan. They're almost always browsed. So that's pretty cool. It's cool to see it for yourself. And here's some of those publication or those extension publications, fact sheets I referenced. So one is the one on the left is based out of Tennessee. The authors are from University of Tennessee, and the one on the right is from one of my alma maters, Purdue University. And you can see I've highlighted some highly preferred species that deer like. So asters, partridge pea, desmodiums, goldenrod, and sunflowers. And then we can look at one of the pollinator plot seed mixes that I frequently recommend. Partridge pea, false sunflower, stiff goldenrod, a number of asters, and wingstem, which is another sunflower. And those are just the preferred species that were listed in this publication. And then, in here also we have the black-eyed Susan, brown-eyed Susan, purple coneflower, lots of clovers. Like these are things that I've shown you deer will browse and that we know, a lot of people put clover in as food plots. So we have very obvious deer food in pollinator plots. And then again, encouraging a shrubby component. We've got all sorts of our native shrubs from the dogwoods, sumac, viburnum, that deer like to browse. And Rabbits, as generalized grazers and browsers, will eat just about anything, so they will be supported by these plots too. And then I pulled this from another extension publication from OSU, a local one, about bobwhite quail and their preferred forage. So again, we see seeds of partridge pea, desmodiums, and sunflowers are great quail forage. And then, surprise, a lot of things like to eat bugs. And what is pollinator habitat if not bug? It's basically just an insect plot. So pollinator habitat is brood rearing habitat, and you'll hear people reference brood rearing habitat all the time when you're talking in the context of upland game birds. So, you know, turkeys require insects that the hens will eat insects during nest laying because it helps with egg development. They get a lot of minerals from that as well as calcium to create that healthy and strong egg. And then poults and chicks of turkeys and quail and pheasants, they need insects to grow, and especially to grow those flight feathers that will protect them when predators come by. So, turkeys, those poults have to stay on the ground until they have flight feathers after a couple weeks of eating insects, and then they can fly up to the roost. But, we need those bugs around for them to grow and develop. And I found this quote here from National Wild Turkey Federation that insects make up about 90% of a poult's diet in the first 2 to 3 weeks and enable development of those feathers. And then I don't talk too much yet about songbirds in this presentation, but obviously a lot of our songbirds eat insects, at least at some stage of their life. If anybody's ever had a bluebird box and you get to watch them hunt and forage for bugs and take those back to the nest or eat them themselves, insects make up a huge amount of the diet for bluebirds. In a Penn State extension publication, throughout a number, about 68% of a bluebird's diet is made up of insects. So if you like birds, you like pollinator habitat. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the other big element of habitat, which is structure or cover. So pollinator habitat, in general, the height of a pollinator habitat is going to be anywhere from like 2 feet to about 4 feet. So, maybe shin to shoulder height on, somebody my height, about 5 feet. And then we have areas that may get taller or certain plants that get taller, like some of our sunflowers, or, if you have tall grasses in there, those can get, 7 to 10 feet range, if we have some good healthy soil happening. But in general, they're short enough for, a deer to like stand up and be able to see around, and in some areas, probably for a turkey hen to kind of stand up and be able to look out for predators. But they're also tall enough for young to be able to lay down or to work through that vegetation and be covered overhead, or at least somewhat obscured if we have some aerial predators coming by, or, if a coyote or fox is running down the edge of the habitat, they're not necessarily going to be able to see all the way through that plot. So we do get some good overhead and lateral cover for a lot of our prey species, again, like turkey and deer fawns. And as an example, this is Profont Prairie down in Hocking County. I think the college down there manages this prairie with fire. And you can see in the front, if you got an eye for it, there's a nice little deer bed here. And you see deer beds everywhere, but they do bed down in pollinator habitat. And then Here is, if you've ever been down to Atwood Lake Dam at the boat launch there, they installed a pollinator plot. It was 2 years old this year, and I helped guide that plot. I was walking around there again in the summer and found a fawn laying down, and I almost got an up close picture of it laying there. And of course, it jumped right as I was snapping the photo. So you can see its tail and some of its spots there in the orange circle. And then stem structure is worth thinking about too. So some plants really, flop over and they're very pliable and bendy. But a lot of these pollinator plants, especially things like goldenrod and some of the grasses we put in there, are stiff stemmed. So they're great places to build nests. Like this red-winged blackbird nest that I found in this same plot here at Atwood Lake Dam. And the really cool thing about this plot is about 4 acres, so it's not giant, but it's not small. But I think it has like road or pavement on 3 sides, and it's a boat launch, so people are in and out of there like all the time. And there were birds nesting and a deer fawn laying there, so it was pretty cool. Okay, bare ground is really super important for, as I described, a lot of our insects, but it's also really important for things like quail and turkey poults. Um, Quail, when they are born, are about the size of the end of your thumb. They are teeny, teeny, tiny. If you try to put them through something like a fescue field or an overgrown pasture, chances are they're going to have a pretty tough time getting around. But these pollinator plots are intentionally made to be somewhat thin and have bare ground between the plants. We don't use any thatch or mat forming grasses. So those quail can kind of travel and turkey poults can travel in between the plants and they can find seeds and bugs laying on top of that soil surface. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to hopefully play you guys this video. It's a minute and a half.
You know, when we talk about great wildlife habitat and diversity, we're talking about a mixture of grasses and forbs, wildflowers, broadleaf plants, all that kinds of thing in a great balance, a balance of both of them. And what we get out of that is bare ground that's so important for pollinator habitat and pheasant and quail habitat. A great wildlife habitat planting that has a balance of grasses and forbs in there is going to naturally have areas of bare ground like this. That's critically important to pheasant and quail chicks that are looking for an area to feed on insects, need to move around, escape predators, that sort of thing, and nesting habitat for native pollinators like native bees. Bare habitat like this is one of the first things that we lose in habitat. Natural succession moves us into something that's more dominated by grasses. That's the time that we need to put some management back on the ground so we can have a balance of grasses, forbs, and bare ground.
So it doesn't get any cuter than that, but what a great demonstration of how bare ground is really important for a lot of our game bird species. And then I just kind of included a chart here to show that, quail, a lot of times the limiting cover is that woody, shrubby component. And, we think about turkeys being more forest associated birds. But grasslands, even, for quail, their preferred composition of grassland on the landscape for them to be able to have good habitat and live out their life cycle is almost 30%. So, these grassland and pollinator habitats can really benefit a number of different type of wildlife, including ones that we think about not as grassland birds. And lastly, I just wanted to touch on the concept of standing winter cover. This can be really important for, again, a lot of our prey species like rabbits and birds as well. But if you think about a lawn or pasture, again, these cool season non-native grasses, they're kind of some of those floppy grasses. And if we get a heavy snow, if you ever go out, you just see a blanket of white. And so there's nothing on that landscape when we have this even height and soft-stemmed vegetation or even plow field, there's nothing out there for wildlife to go and hide out in or really to find food in. So vegetation that stays standing in the winter and still allows some movement within it is really important. And this filter strip here kind of demonstrates that had a lot of native forbs in there, and it looked great after a light snow. And then escape cover as well. So again, I'm going to come back to the shrubby component. Um, you know, um, dense woody vegetation is really great. If a predator comes by, the game species can zip off into those shrub thickets. And those also are great protection in heavy snows or in ice storms. So that denser escape cover woody component in pollinator habitat can be really important if you're managing for something like rabbits or quail. And there's a lot of songbirds that love shrub thickets too. And that can be seen kind of back here, this reddish tip. There was some really pretty red osier dogwood and gray dogwood back there. Okay, so kind of shifting from how wildlife use pollinator habitats, let's talk about how we create it. I like to kind of set the stage here and set expectations for how pollinator habitat is created because it's not the easiest habitat to create or to steward. Our native forbs tend to be pretty slow growing, or the perennials are. And there's even a saying to describe this. So sleep, creep, and leap. So in the first year, these plants, they might get this big, 4 to 6 inches, and they're kind of hiding beneath the weeds. And what is happening there is they're not throwing out flowers, they're not even throwing out a lot of leaves, but they are growing really robust root systems. Our native prairie plants can throw roots down into the soil up to 15 feet and sometimes greater depending on the species. So they're doing some work, you just can't see it. So in that first year, they sleep. In the second year, they creep, meaning they're sending out more leaves, and sometimes you'll see a sprout off to the side, so they're throwing out, I don't know if they're called tillers like grasses are, but they're throwing off a shoot over here. But again, still just mostly leaves, not a lot happening with flowers. So they're creeping. And then the third year they leap. So they finally grow up vertically and they will flower. So the point here is that these native pollinator plots don't really mature and become competitive until year 3 after seeding, which is a really long time to wait. And it's also gives a lot of room for weeds to move in and to take over. So taking your time on site preparation is really essential and helps, ensure success for these plots. So I like to break out creating a pollinator habitat into 4 basic stages. So site preparation, planting, establishment, management or maintenance in the first year, and then long-term maintenance. So again, site preparation is absolutely essential, and the purpose is really just to manage the competition for those slow-growing native plants. So we want to get rid of what's growing on the site currently if it's not native and it's competitive to pollinator habitats. We also want to suppress the seed bank. So if these non-native plants have been growing on the site for a pretty long time, we likely will have germination of weed seed that those plants have been throwing out year after year. And we don't want that to happen at the same time as our pollinator plants are germinating. We want to get rid of all that junk before we put that pollinator seed on the ground. And we want to open bare ground. When we plant seeds, they have to make contact with the soil. Even if it's very shallow contact, they do still need to make contact with the soil to be able to germinate. So we need to open up some bare ground there. There's some more or less common practices that people use to do site preparation. Probably the most commonly used is a chemical fallow. The benefits of this is that it can be used on acreage of any size. It can be used on slopes. It can be used on shadier sites. And it's pretty easy to find the equipment and materials or somebody to hire to do this for you. So it's a pretty available practice to be able to do site preparation with. But obviously it's not available for people who don't want to use herbicides, and that definitely happens. So it's not available for organic operations, and we're still learning a lot about our native insect life. Herbicides are not insecticides. They are not meant to kill bugs. But there have been some findings of sublethal effects like difficulty mapping to find food related to herbicides, and there are ways to mitigate those risks. But for people who are really worried about that, obviously that's a downside that can be worth considering for some folks. But a lot of people are using this method, and this is usually what we start with if people are open to it. I thought I had eliminated these slides, so I'll just kind of move through it. So the point here is that this tends to involve more than one application of herbicide, and the purpose of that is to address that seed bank. So we want to let those weed seeds germinate, and we want to kill off that stuff too. Notice that I did not mention disking, and that is intentional. So for the projects I plan on, I tend to avoid disking because it is a form of disturbance, which can encourage weed growth. And especially if you have invasive species like Canada thistle or teasel, we want to avoid turning that stuff up to the soil surface because we don't want that stuff on the site. So I tend to avoid disking. If you are going to disc, it's really great to at least plan for one more herbicide after that disking goes through to address whatever might germinate after that most recent disking. Solarization is another method that comes up a lot in conversation. I am just seeing it implemented this year after 3 years on the job. So it's not commonly applied, but it is a great organic option for preparing smaller sites. It just involves laying clear 4 to 6 millimeter thick plastic on a site, not black plastic, and leaving it there for a growing season. And it cooks off the vegetation that's laying there, it cooks off the weed seed bank, and it opens bare ground. So it works really well for preparing the site. But we really need that to capture the heat of the sun, so it's most appropriate for sunny sites and for flat sites. And it is pretty expensive to source this plastic if you don't have a source like a high tunnel where you can borrow some material from. There are also soil health and microbial concerns because it really heats things up underneath there. But it does garner a really good clean starting surface. Similarly, plowing is another great organic option. Great in terms that it yields a very clean start. It can be done on fields of any size or projects of any size. And it's probably the shortest timeline aside from moving from a crop field to a seeding, which is also an option that I love. But really, it only should be used on relatively flat locations because we don't want our soil eroding into our waterways or polluting our air. And obviously, there's just soil health concerns in general. On a site that has never been cropped or never been plowed or tilled, I would completely avoid this practice. We want to On some of those virgin sites that haven't been cropped before, there could be a really cool seed bank there, and we don't want to bury it 6 inches underneath the soil. We want to pull that stuff out of that seed bank. So this is really one for previously disturbed sites, but it is a good option. You can see here that this is done with what's called a mold board, or some people call it a bottom plow. There's not a whole lot of people using this equipment anymore. So the piece of equipment can be hard to come by. But if you got one, it can be a good option. Okay, moving on to planting. Getting towards the end here. So planting is done with 2 methods and 2 different times of year. And this is where really working with a conservation planner and coming up with a plan for your site and your timeline and your equipment is helpful. So broadcast seeding or no-till drill seeding are both options. For my area in Northeast Ohio, and I like to see a broadcast seeding done. It's really nice because a lot of these pollinator seeds are teeny, 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 tiny. And if you plant them at all, some of them, if you plant them at all, they will not germinate. Some of these seeds actually need to lay on the soil of the surface to germinate. So broadcast seeding is like, simulating the natural process. And it's really great for winter seedings where that winter action the freeze and thaw action will draw those seeds down at the right depth. But native grass drills are really great for some projects too. I really love to see the seed drilled if we're doing a spring planting, or perhaps there's concerns about the seed blowing away or washing away. A drill can be a good way to make sure those seeds get down into the soil. It's also good for if you have a site with a fair amount of residue. I love to see a winter seeding, again, because it mimics that natural process. A lot of our native forbs have to go through that winter freeze and thaw to break dormancy. It breaks up that seed coat so they can germinate. If you plant those in the spring, they may not germinate until the following spring. So I like the winter seedings the best, but again, I've shown you guys some pictures of a project that was seeded like on the last day in the spring seeding window, and it looks just fine. So both work, but there are some benefits to winter seedings that I like to capture. Some things to think about. I get a lot of questions about seed mixes. The secret is I use default seed mixes that are available on the market. There's some tricky things about making your own seed mixes that take a lot of time, and there's a lot of good default mixes. So, but it is good to consider your goals. If you are trying to support specific species and like specific plants, we need to include those. If you want to be able to burn, we want to include grass. So consider your goals. We want them to be primarily made up of native species, and native species to the region. There are some thoughtful exceptions, like certain annual plants that we like to throw in for first year color, or things that just put out a lot of good food, like some of the clovers. But generally, we want to keep things somewhat local, at least to the Midwest. You want to think about your local conditions, so your field level conditions, especially as it relates to drainage and the amount of sunlight that you get. And then I like to mention seeding rates because on the market you do see recommendations for really heavy seed rates, 150 seeds per square foot. Now, that's going to give you a really beautiful pollinator plot that is absolutely loaded with plants that are going to bloom all year. But we talked so much about the importance of bare ground. And if you overseed and the seeding does well, I just think it makes sense that you're going to have less space between the plants for movement of wildlife, and you're going to have a quicker build up of thatch. that is going to completely cover the ground surface. And, that can speed up your management timeline as well. So the NRCS standards for seedings run from 30 to 50 seeds per square foot, and that is something that I do encourage people to, well, I have to encourage them to follow, but it's for a good reason. Okay. And then after the planting, we kind of shift into this, adaptive management. We see what happens and then we address it. But in general, I do recommend that people mow their pollinator plots in the first year. And I always tell people, you're going to hate me because it's going to start to bloom. And then I'm going to tell you, you got to go mow it. And I'm going to make you do it. I put the mowing in my contracts for the programs I work with because it is so important. So what this does is it manages the competition for these teeny pollinator plots that are in the understory in that first year, and they might be dominated by fast-growing annual wildflowers, and then, we get a lot of foxtail and mare's tail that might come up in the first year as well. Almost always comes up in the first year. So what happens is when we mow, it clips off those weed seed heads. And you can see, these simulated annual wildflowers, they still have leaves, they still have roots. And now our baby pollinator perennial plants get some sunlight and get some space to grow. And we have also removed the seed heads of those fast growing weeds so that we're not just continually dumping foxtail seed and mare's tail seed back into the pollinator plot. These pointers down here are really important, so don't mow it too low because we don't want to clip off the leaves of the plants that we're trying to encourage. And you don't want to mow it later than mid-August because we want our focal plants to gather enough energy to come back out again in the second year. So the height especially is something to pay attention to, but you do want to do your management mowing. Okay, some quick examples, and then I got one slide on long-term management, and then we're doing questions. So these are all projects that I was involved with, and I'm watching evolve year after year, which is super fun. It is so fun to see your hard work out on the ground. Me, it's just my brain. I don't do any implementation. That's all the landowners, but it's really cool to see other people's hard work out on the ground and see the results of that. So get on it, you guys are gonna love it. But this was a plot in Stark County. It's actually at Marlington High School, and it's right, the power lines here are a road to the east. It's east of the football field. So if you ever want to go and see this is public ground. But the seeding was done literally the last day of the spring seeding deadline, and they did a broadcast seeding into soybean stubble. So, we were experimenting. I would have liked to see an earlier seeding or maybe a drill seeding, but that's what they had available and that's what they did. The next month, it was getting pretty weedy, so they mowed it off and it came back primarily in foxtail, which is really common for a cropland conversion. But if you can see these yellow spots down here, we had some partridge pea that was starting to bloom already, which is a good sign. Year 2, early on, we got a lot of clover. That is, I'm finding pretty common if you include clover in your seed mixes. I have not decided if I liked that, but there was a lot of clover and we were moving on with it. And then this year it looked like this. So we have foxglove beard tongue, we have landsleaf coreopsis, we have swamp milkweed, we have plenty of goldenrod, and we have some weeds too. So some velvet grass, there's a little bit of reed canary grass along the ditch, but overall, I mean, this sure beats a soybean field for pollinators and, seeing a lot of songbirds and stuff out here too. But that mowing was really essential for them because it really knocked back the foxtail. This was another one. This is a wetland reserve easement project in Ashtabula County. We went out in July after a drill spring seeding. And my goodness, was the mare's tail very scary. This left-hand photo. They mowed it shortly after we made this visit. And then in October, look at all those black-eyed Susans in the first year after seeding. So that was looking really good. That mowing was really important. And then this one I wanted to include because this was a turf grass conversion. A lot of people are doing turf grass conversions. Cropland conversions are a little easier, but it can be done on turf grass if you do your good site prep, which these landowners did. So this was a chemical fallow. It looked really good in the spring. They did a broadcast seeding and culti-packed it in. They did their mowing in the summer, and then in year 2, it looked like this. So all this Rudbeckia, all this black-eyed Susan was their newer pollinator plot, that seeding where the dead grass was. And on the right-hand side, we have an older pollinator plot that you can tell there's some Joe Pye weed here, some purple coneflower on the edge. But they did a really nice job on that plot. They really did everything to a T, and it's paying off. So last slide. This is a whole different presentation in and of itself, but I like to tell people about long-term management because if you do not manage your grassland habitat in Ohio, it will turn into forest. Aside from maybe reclaimed mine sites and things with really thin soils, but you got to manage these things or they will get really shrubby and eventually just have a bunch of trees on them. So make a plan for long-term management. There are different methods to do this. Prescribed burning really is the best, but it is not a practice that's available to a lot of people. And so again, we work with what we got. Flash grazing, if you have cattle or sheep or maybe goats, if we're working on trees and eliminating trees and shrubs. But putting animals on there, letting them eat it down, and then removing the animals off can be a really good tool. Haying is really great. Doing a mowing and then a light disking to open up some of that bare ground, bury some of that residue. If you do it at the right time, can be a good tool. And then at minimum, keeping the trees and the blackberries down with targeted mowing. Is like a bare minimum that you'll have to do to do your long-term management. So hopefully that gives you an idea of kind of what's involved in creating this stuff and how we get to your end goals. There are people out there to talk to you about this stuff. We do not expect landowners to just like do rubber to the road right away and know everything that their site needs. Maybe your site has a lot of invasive species. Maybe your site is really wet. Like there are a lot of scenarios in Ohio that do take some specialized knowledge. So it's really great to work with a biologist, with a conservation planner that can help assess your specific site and come up with a plan for you and your property. I'm one of those people, especially if you have a pollinator habitat specific interest. There's also people like Robert in soil and water offices, the NRCS offices, Division of Wildlife has private lands biologists. So there's a lot of great people out there to help you do projects like this. Last but not least, I wanted to mention that this stuff is not free to do. Herbicide costs money, putting a burn on the ground costs money, seed definitely costs money. If that is a limiting factor for you, there are conservation incentive programs that can be used on private land. And 2 of those programs are running an open application period right now until the end of January. So if that is something that you think you want to try to take advantage of, again, talk with your local Natural Resources Conservation Service office, NRCS. Every county has one. Or you can talk to your Farm Bill biologist. EQIP and CSP are Farm Bill programs. So we are here to talk to you about how those programs can support your wildlife goals. But do get started on that because those application deadlines come up quick this time of year. And with that, thank you, and hopefully I kept you a little longer than I wanted to, but really happy to answer any questions for folks who are still on.
So, just have a couple of questions as of right now, Abby. The first one is just clarifying about mowing. Mow it every time it reaches knee high, or mow it back every time it reaches knee high to 8 inches, spring through August 15th. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. So you seed it and then it's gonna grow up. I tell people around knee height or before any of the nasties start to throw out buds or blooms, because we don't want to let those seed in. Um, and then, yeah, just kind of repeat as needed. Let the field tell you what it needs. Most people are putting on about 2 mows in that first year, sometimes 3. And then hopefully you will not have to mow annually after that. You should be able to shift to, spot mowing, in year 2, 3, or 4.
Okay. The other one, as of right now, is asking about the best management of blackberry and the best
Mhm.
burn practices.
Okay, blackberries. That's a tough one because they can really take over. The guy, I believe his name is Dave Nolan. He's got some really great ideas about prairie management. He found and helped restore Huffman Prairie out in Dayton area, Preble County. He's got such great knowledge. His suspicion is that blackberry takeover is due to infrequent management. So if you are trying to mow out the blackberries and they keep coming back, you gotta keep mowing. Or, mow it, let them resprout and then graze them and then let them resprout and then with herbicide and just kind of keep going after it until you reduce those blackberries back into the size that you want. Um, but it will take repeated effort. Um, and there's different management methods. There are certain herbicides that if you have like a concentrated area that you can use on the blackberries to manage those. The trick is to manage the blackberries, which are woody, broadleaf plants. A lot of the herbicides that attack blackberry will also attack our native forbs. So be careful about that. Um, and then just burning in general.
Yeah, it's best burn practice is what the question is.
Okay, best burn practices for pollinator habitat. So timing is important. Um, in Ohio, we see a lot of dormant season burns. Um, if you do it often enough, this can knock back woody vegetation, but it can also encourage grasses. So you can kind of shift the composition from mostly or at least half wildflowers to mostly native grasses. So that's something to pay attention to. Um, so growing spring or growing season burns, I think are more preferable for pollinators, but with our open burning regulations in Ohio, this can be tough to do. So you might have to work with a certified burn manager. Um, I have not been involved in a lot of burns for pollinator habitat. So if this is something that you're really trying to get put on the ground and you want some resources for that, reach out to me through my contact information and I can pull more detailed information for you. But that's what I got off the top of my head.
Okay. And then I know kind of before we started, we got on the subject of, managing small pollinator plots. I know a lot of local folks here, especially with our, seedling sales over the last few years, have started these small, garden plots.
Mhm.
Is management for those any different than, say, large scale management? And what are your recommendations for that management?
Yeah. And plots where you can do like handwork, like you can just use hands and tools to manage plots. and work with like individual plants, leaving those set over winter. But after insects have mostly emerged, you can clip back dead vegetation a little shorter, and you could probably even like rake out the debris on ground level to open up bare ground. In those really small like garden style plots, you're probably not going to get a lot of like composition shift. Probably the biggest, what I've seen in my home garden plot is the Canada goldenrod's starting to move in. So continually cutting back any Canada goldenrod that you think is getting aggressive. It might be another management need for those smaller plots. Um, and yeah, as far as like prairie style, still small but too big to do handwork on. Um, I think mowing or spot clipping probably would be good again to address Canada goldenrod, blackberries. As far as residue, um, you know, I still think like a high mowing and then a very light disking, like 2 inches deep, like scratching the surface. If you can find a way to do that with like a conventional garden tiller or, something you have on hand, that probably would be a good way to set things back a little bit. Um, these questions can be hard to answer because everything's very catered to the actual plot that you're managing and what's there. But again, that's kind of what comes to mind. I don't know if I answered the question.
And then one other question, I don't know what you guys deal with up in northeastern Ohio, but certainly down here in our reverting farm fields and such, autumn olive has become a huge issue. We're starting to see, honeysuckle popping up and privet becoming more and more of an issue.
Mhm.
What are the best ways for managing invasives in these pollinator plantings?
Yeah. Yeah, that really is a tough one. I think prevention, getting out on the gator or taking a hike with your wife or your husband and taking a hand sprayer, backpack sprayer along is great. Or going out for a walk after a rainy day like today, and pulling up those seedlings that are small enough to get, the root systems out. That's probably going to be the cheapest and the least time consuming thing that you can do. Once they get too big, then you're talking about, probably again, like frequent mowing, which isn't great for pollinator aspect, but like is essential for maintaining those plots. And you can spot mow or strip mow. We never really want you to manage an entire pollinator habitat all at one time. We always want you leaving some of that plot undisturbed. So if you have areas that are, heavier in autumn olive or privet or what have you, like spot mowing those areas on a more frequent rotation probably would be a good place to start. Um, and, if it keeps coming back, really herbicide is your friend. Unfortunately, it's just the way of things right now until we figure out a better way.
I had one other question come up. How small of a plot is too small to be relevant?
I have like a 3x3 plot at my house that I really love and I see really cool stuff at. I have seen Orioles stripping, fibers off of goldenrod plants. I see all sorts of cool bees and moths. So no plot is too small. In terms of programs, we get this question a lot. We don't turn people away based on size, and applications are not ranked on size, but there is like a cost benefit analysis loosely that needs to be done. Um, where how much paperwork do you want to fill out for how much money? And our planning software, generally, we're working in at least a tenth of an acre. Um, so maybe that gives you some idea, but do what you can. I mean, no plot is too small.
something I'll comment. I don't know if anybody else on here, but I follow Danae Wolf of Chasing Bugs on Facebook, and she is up
Okay.
in the Worcester area, and she has done some very small, like tree, surround type beds, and again is seeing some really cool stuff with, 30, 40, 50 plants. So, certainly there are options out there for small areas, and if you have questions or whatever, reach out to us here at the office or somebody like Abby or any of the other natural resource professionals. And if we don't know the answer, we can probably find the person that does. So,
Absolutely.
all right. Well, thanks everybody for joining in. If you have any other questions, punch them in now or forever hold your speech. Otherwise, we'll plan to do another one in February. Looking at trying to get Bob Mulligan to do something about forest roads and trails and kind of how to properly lay out things and how to access your property while still reducing erosion and that sort of thing. So don't have anything finalized, but hopefully we'll have things finalized for the newsletter, which will go out the first part of the year. So. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.